It began beneath the domed vaults of the Sala Clementina, where centuries of whispered intrigues had stained the stones, though few dared speak them aloud. On that morning, beneath the gaze of marble saints, the world's cameras turned toward one man, Pope Leo XIV. And across from him, with a pen poised like a dagger, sat Marco Rinaldi, a journalist known not for reverence, but for sharp angles and harder questions. His aim? To expose what the Vatican had refused to clarify. The true nature of Pope Leo's relationship with Cardinal Luis Tagle, a man beloved by many, mistrusted by others, and now, shrouded in rumor. Rinaldi thought this would be the moment to force clarity, perhaps even fracture trust. He believed that beneath Leo's calm eyes, silence concealed guilt. And that guilt would crack. But what he did not know, was that the reply awaiting him, spoken with words forged in suffering, tempered by faith, would not only silence the room. It would shake the conscience of the world. Before we dive in, comment where you're watching from. You'll want to stay till the end. And if you won't, why? Write your reason below. Some truths are easier ignored than heard. Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle, a man whose smile had calmed the trembling hands of the poor, whose voice had consoled grieving mothers beneath floodlit slums. To many, he was the face of a tender church, one that dared to embrace the margins. Yet in certain corners of marble halls, whispers grew, too merciful, some said. Too willing to blur the lines of doctrine. And there stood Pope Leo XIV, a pontiff elected in the shadow of turmoil, a man who had astonished friend and foe alike. Where others clung to ancient walls, he opened new doors. Yet behind that open gaze burned a fierce guardian of sacred tradition, one who believed mercy and truth were not adversaries, but eternal companions. Then there was Marco Rinaldi. Young, sharp, restless. A voice rising from Rome's modern press. He wore ambition like a second skin, and beneath his questions lay not curiosity, but conviction. He had come armed with rumor and innuendo, determined to strip away the Vatican's veil. The moment? A press conference unlike any before. The Sala Clementina swelled with camera crews, correspondents, and ecclesiastical dignitaries, their faces tense with unspoken questions. For the first time, Pope Leo XIV would address what many now whispered as the Tagle question. Was there a fracture beneath the papal throne? Had the friendship between Pope and Cardinal frayed beneath the weight of doctrine and politics? And why did it matter? Because the words spoken here, in this gilded chamber, could either bind a wounded church, or break it further. Are you ready to hear it? And if you aren't, write it below. The church cannot heal through silence. The air beneath the vaulted ceiling had grown dense. Heatless lights buzzed. Fingers hovered over recorders. No one stirred. Marco Rinaldi cleared his throat, his voice wrapped in a diplomat's velvet, yet the blade beneath was clear. Holy Father, he began, his tone measured, almost deferential. Is it true you've distanced yourself from Cardinal Tagle for political reasons? For the briefest moment, the chamber seemed to lean toward the white-clad figure seated at its heart. Pope Leo XIV lifted his gaze, not with irritation, nor surprise, but with a patience earned through many winters of the soul. My brother and I, he replied, voice firm yet warm, speak often. Love does not measure distance. A subtle murmur swept the journalists, a deft parry cloaked in grace. Yet Marco's eyes sharpened. The game was not so easily played. But, Marco pressed, his tone tightening like a wire, your recent appointments suggest otherwise. Is mercy now a liability within this pontificate? The question hung in the air, barbed, deliberate. The watching world held its breath. Pope Leo's lips curved, not in dismissal, but in quiet knowing. Mercy, he answered, voice like a slow stream over ancient stone, is the only currency heaven honors. A beat. Then another. The chamber's hush deepened, not a silence of absence, but of presence. Behind his camera, an aging Vatican correspondent whispered, "He is leading him somewhere," and indeed, he was. Marco's fingers twitched against his notepad. The subtle shift was beginning, he felt it, though could not yet name it. The path he had prepared so carefully now seemed uncertain beneath his feet. Would you have answered as calmly? If not, subscribe. If you still won't, write Y below. The test of faith is coming. The brief moment of quiet did not last. Underneath the veneer of cordiality, Marco Rinaldi's pulse quickened. His notes blurred beneath impatient fingers. His questions were prepared, sharpened long before this day. And this answer, gentle though it was, would not be the end. He straightened in his chair, voice losing its earlier silk, now laced with a cooler edge. But does not Cardinal Tagle, he asked, words landing with pointed precision, promote views that could divide the faithful? Are you not concerned about the Church's unity? There it was, the charge laid bare. A challenge not only to friendship, but to doctrine, to authority, to the very heart of Leo's papacy. Yet Pope Leo did not flinch. He did not glance to aids. His gaze, calm as the still sea beneath an approaching storm, met Marco's full on. "I have seen unity in slums," he answered, voice low but resonant, "and division in gold chambers." He allowed the words to breathe, then continued. "Unity is not uniformity," he said softly, "it is communion. Communion with the wounded, the searching, the forgotten. Communion across chasms of pain and difference." And then, he spoke of Manila. "I remember," the Pope said, his voice slowing as memory carried him, standing beside Cardinal Tagle in the broken streets of Manila, beneath tin roofs that could not keep out the rain. "We entered a home where the floor was dirt, and the air hung heavy with grief. A mother sat cradling her dying child, skin pale, breath shallow. Her eyes found mine. Not as a pope, but as a man. As a brother. There, no one asked doctrine. No one debated policy. Only love remained." His words fell upon the chamber like a benediction. Even cameras seemed to still. The faint hum of equipment now seemed an intrusion on something deeper, older, sacred. Across the room, Marco's brow furrowed. His pen hovered, unsure whether to strike or to rest. The path he had envisioned, a simple expose, now seemed to twist and blur before him. Was this man evading? Or revealing a truth he had not prepared to confront? Are you listening, or waiting to argue? If listening, subscribe. If resisting, say Y below. Some resist love more than truth. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The echo of Manila's grief still lingered, casting shadows upon the marble walls. Somewhere in the back row, a young reporter forgot to breathe. Even the cameras, ravenous by nature, seemed to hesitate, as if reluctant to fracture the sacred hush that had settled upon the room. But Marco Rinaldi was not finished. His pride, a fragile thing, bruised beneath Leo's words, urged him forward. His questions were no longer merely professional, they had become personal. He leaned in now, not the calculated lean of the journalist, but the restless lean of a man seeking to regain ground lost beneath his feet. "So you are defending him," Marco pressed, voice sharp with frustration, endorsing his dangerous agenda. The words, once measured, now cracked faintly at their edges. The trap was sprung. Yet in his heart, Marco knew, this was no longer a game he controlled. A pause. The weight of the room grew unbearable. A bead of sweat traced the journalist's temple. Around them, the assembly held its collective breath, every lens fixed, every heart straining toward the answer that would surely come. And then, Pope Leo XIV spoke. Not hurriedly. Not to deflect. But with the gravity of a man who had walked through fire, and still bore its mark. His voice, when it came, was lower now, charged with sacred fire, each word a stone laid upon the conscience. "I have held dying children in my arms." A ripple, barely audible, moved through the chamber. You call it naive, to protect them? A pause, deeper than the last. I call it sacred. No one moved. Camera shutters clicked, staccato bursts that felt vulgar in that moment. Marco's lips parted, yet no words came. For before him stood not merely a pontiff, nor a politician, but a man whose authority was not borrowed from office, but forged in the crucible of human suffering. And in that single breath, the room's axis shifted. The accuser stood disarmed. The accused, unchallenged, immovable, undeniable. Would you have stood silent, or spoken? If you believe truth should be spoken, subscribe. If not, write your reason below. Let the world see your heart. The silence following Pope Leo's last words lingered. Not the stillness of mere pause, but the solemn hush of a room caught between conviction and discomfort. And yet, pride dies slowly. Even now, Marco Rinaldi fought to steady his voice. His notes blurred before him, yet the instinct to press, to reclaim the narrative, clawed within him. He drew a breath, thin and taut, and spoke once more. But gone was the velvet, now, only the strained insistence of a man clinging to diminishing ground. Is defending such views? Marco asked. His voice tight, not risking the Church's moral authority. A question crafted to echo beyond this room. A question he hoped would cast doubt not only upon Tagle, but upon Leo himself. But the Pope's gaze, gentle, unyielding, met his without hesitation. And when he spoke, the room seemed to shrink around his words. You confuse engagement with endorsement. The line fell with the weight of a bell tolling through the marrow of the gathered souls. I will walk among sinners, because I am one. A murmur, not of dissent, but of recognition, swept through the elder clergy present. Truth unveiled speaks in the heart before it reaches the mind. And Pope Leo continued, his voice neither raised nor rushed, simply certain. The shepherd does not abandon lost sheep. He pursues them, even when the path grows treacherous. Even when others choose comfort over compassion. Marco's hand faltered upon his pen. Around them, breath was held. The line between accusation and self-examination had blurred irreparably. And then, the final blow, delivered not with triumph, but with transcendent clarity. Pope Leo rose slightly, turning his gaze not to Marco alone, but to the room, to the cameras, to the unseen millions who would soon bear witness. If defending children, he said, each word measured and resonant, welcoming the outcast, and speaking of mercy, makes one dangerous, then Christ himself was dangerous. The chamber froze. No rebuttal rose. The logic of the heart had silenced the cunning of the mind. Marco's fingers trembled. His pen, lowered. And across the room, eyes once sharpened with skepticism now glistened with the first stirrings of understanding, or shame. Will you lower yours, or carry the truth forward? Subscribe if you will. And if not, tell us below. What part of mercy unsettles you? For a breathless moment, the world stood still within the gilded chamber. The Pope's words, unadorned by rhetoric, unshielded by doctrine, hung suspended like incense in the air. And in that silence, the battle ended, not with triumph, but with a deeper call to the soul. Pope Leo XIV's gaze shifted now, beyond Marco's weary form, beyond the clicking cameras, beyond the walls of the Vatican itself. He looked to the faces before him, some cloaked in clerical garb, some in suits, some in the weariness of those who had long ceased to hope. And in that gaze, they saw not a pontiff defending a comrade, nor a leader protecting his reign. They saw a shepherd speaking to his flock. His voice, when it rose again, was no longer aimed at one man, but at all who could still hear. This is not about a journalist, he began, his words soft, unwavering, nor about a cardinal. It is about what kind of church we wish to be. A pause, long enough to let the weight settle in each heart. It is about what kind of world we will leave to our children. Then, with deliberate grace, Pope Leo reached within his vestments and drew forth a small crucifix, its wood worn by the hands of those who had carried burdens too great to name. He lifted it, not high, not with spectacle, but with the quiet reverence of one who understood the price it bore. "We need fewer walls," he said, his voice now threaded with the ache of longing, and more bridges. Fewer voices shouting, more hearts listening. And across the room, a shift. Arms once crossed unfolded. Brows once furrowed softened. Even the youngest among the press now looked not for the next question, but for the next truth. And Marco Rinaldi? The fire that had driven him flickered now, replaced not with defeat, but with something deeper, more fragile. A single tear glistened at the corner of his eye, whether born of shame, of release, or of revelation, none could say. And at last, the room breathed again. Will your heart listen? Subscribe if so. And if you resist, write below. Why does listening to love feel dangerous to you? And now, the room stood emptied of noise, yet filled with something heavier than sound, conviction, perhaps, or conscience awakened. Marco's gaze had fallen, not in shame, but in the weary humility of one who had glimpsed a truth larger than ambition. And beyond those marble walls, cameras would soon carry this moment across continents, through screens and cities where hearts still wrestled between comfort and calling. But now, it is not the room that matters. It is not the journalist, nor the pontiff, nor even the cardinal whispered upon the air. It is you. And you, what would you have said in that room? Would you defend the innocent, or the institution? Would you choose the shield of doctrine, or the wounds of mercy? A pause, let the question find its way past words, past reason, to where the truest answers dwell. Comment below with courage, the voice continues, gentle, insistent. Let us reflect together, not as judges, but as pilgrims who have not yet arrived. And with a breath, as though releasing a weight unseen, the narrator's voice lowers into blessing, and may we all seek truth with humble hearts. And never mistake applause for anointing. Subscribe to Faith Hidden Stories, not for stories, but for awakenings. Still won't? Then write below, what in this truth made you hesitate?